On November 12th, 1982, when I was 8 years old, a movie came out that I was lucky enough to see in the theaters, and it was a movie that changed my life. And it was a movie that helped sort of define my love for horror and the horror genre and EC Comics. The film is so important to me. It was important to me as a child. It is important to me now. And with the passing of George Romero this past Sunday, I felt the best way to pay tribute to him was talking about the movie that he made that changed my life. That movie is Creepshow. Horror Zone. So before Creepshow was a movie, it was a book that my mom actually got for me. Again, I was about 7, probably almost 8 when this book came out. So I have the original publishing of the Creepshow companion, if you want to call it, with the art by Bernie Wrightson, who also passed away this year. And as you can see, it is pretty battle damaged. I actually have a tape here to hold it together, and it actually has my name on the inside of it. Don't laugh, I went by Benji when I was little. But this book was something my mom got me at the mall, at the bookstore that I used to go to. It was Stephen King, and at this point in my life, so about, I was about 7 years old, I was in love with Salem's Lot. I had finally overcame my fear at about this point in my childhood and was a huge Stephen King fan, didn't know what Stephen King looked like. And I remember my mom saying, well, this is Stephen King right here on the back of the book. And I remember being fascinated by that picture. But realizing, I was starting to get into movies now because Salem's Lot was such a big part of my life. And I remember having this book with me. And there's some pretty foul language in this book if you read it. But I had no idea what EC Comics were, even though I did like comic books. But at the time, I was mostly collecting like the Incredible Hulk and things like that. I had no idea that there was horror comic books. And I remember my grandmother being upset with some of the language in this and being kind of concerned that my mom had bought it for me. But mostly just because of the language. She had no problem with the horror, but my grandmother's very religious and doesn't like bad language. So she was put off by the language, but I remember reading this book that summer, having it with me all the time, and that's why it's so battle damaged. I was fascinated by these stories, especially The Crate and Father's Day. They were my two favorites. And I was so fascinated that this was actually going to be a movie, because on the corner here it says now a very scary movie. Right there. And of course it was screenplay by Stephen King and directed by George A. Romero. And with George Romero passing away, it just, it's sort of a sucker punch every time we lose one of these greats in the horror genre. And, losing George Romero is losing another godfather of horror, in my opinion, and it's a very sad time to lose somebody. And I didn't know that he was suffering from cancer. I knew he was a smoker, but sad to hear that he had lost his battle with lung cancer. But I really didn't get into, just to give you a little history on myself, I was never a big fan of the zombie movies until I got older. So Creepshow for me was sort of my introduction to Romero. Creepshow for me is probably the second most important Stephen King movie for me growing up, because Salem's Lot introduced me to Stephen King, and then Creepshow was the next Stephen King movie. And the fact that George Romero directed the film, that film is just so visually amazing for a film that came out in 1982. And I still remember going to the theater. My dad took me to see it, and I remember just being fascinated seeing this comic book that I had been carrying around all year played out for me live. I mean, it was like for me, it was the first comic book movie I'd ever seen. So it was just amazing watching it, and the fact that I was able to experience that. I got to see this thing in the theater. There's not a lot of people that can probably say that they saw Creepshow in the theater, especially at 8 years old. And that was an amazing experience for me. And Creepshow just means so much to me. And the way that Romero directed it, the cast in it, it's just a fantastic film. And I had to watch Creepshow. And actually, I brought out my Creepshow collection because not only is Creepshow important, but I also love Creepshow 2. And you know, I mean, I've had the DVD of Creepshow for such a long time. One of my favorite films. Just a lot of fun. It's a fun horror film. It's scary. It's funny. It just has so many great elements to it, and you know, just an amazing film. And it's sad. It's amazing that this was George Romero's only #1 film at the box office. Because I watched Creepshow, and then I also watched the amazing documentary on the making of Creepshow, Just Desserts. And I don't know if people have this film or have seen this film. Initially, this was a part of Creepshow's European release, and it wasn't released here in the States until last year. And it was put out by Synapse Films. I got it for a really good deal. But this is an amazing documentary about what went into making Creepshow. And I felt like, you know, on the day that he passed, I had to watch both of these. And it was a lot of fun watching this film and knowing how much he loved this film and how much he wanted to make more of them. And it's sad that we only got another Creepshow 2 and that he didn't direct it, but I still love Creepshow 2. Of course, I have the Arrow video release, and then I also have this release that came out about 17 years ago. Is a pretty down day. I mean, it was just really sad to lose somebody, and I know he was working on another zombie film. The guy just kept going. I heard he was one of the nicest people on the planet, and I know from so many friends of mine that I've met here through the horror community on YouTube that they've met him at times at other conventions, said he was one of the nicest men on the planet, and it's heartbreaking that he's no longer with us. And just because this film has meant so much to me, I thought the most important thing I can do in paying tribute to George A. Romero is talking about the film that really changed my childhood. I mean, Creepshow kind of catapulted me into the horror fan that I am now. Because it came along at a time where I was still pretty young. I really wasn't into the Friday the 13th as much as I got into them when I got to be about 10 and 11. So, you know, it was sort of like Salem's Lot and then Creepshow. Those were the two that sort of kicked off my love of horror and love of the horror genre. And I want to thank George Romero for making this film, for him and Stephen King, and for just making this such an important film in my childhood and in my life. Creepshow is a movie that I will always treasure, and it's a terrific legacy, one of the many terrific legacies that George Romero will leave behind in his passing. And my heart goes out to his family, his friends, his former colleagues, everyone that was touched by him or moved by him in some way in terms of his art and what he's done and his personality and just what an amazing man that he was. So just wanted to do a really quick tribute to the late George Romero, and I felt like the best way to do it was talking about one of my favorite films of all time and one of the most important films to me, and that is Creepshow. So that is going to be it, my fellow fiends. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to watch this video. If you had the honor of meeting George Romero, or if you're a fan of Creepshow or any of his other films, please leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. I would love to hear from any stories that people have and they want to share. I really appreciate everyone's time. Thanks so much for watching this video, paying tribute to one of the horror legends that we lost this week, that is George Romero. And I want to thank everyone again for taking the time to watch. So have a good evening. Stay scared.
I love Creepshow, and I think it could have really been a franchise. And to this day, I would love to remake it. I think we could be making Creepshow 7 right now. And, you know, having a ball, having a gas. I loved it. I still love the idea. I love the old EC comic books, and I think that we could really knock one